My name is Nate. I am the lead pastor here, so thanks for being here this morning on the special weekend. Kids, thank you so much for being here. I know that I made these services too early for you on Meta Weekend, and I feel terrible for you that you had to get up as early as you did, especially like the 15 girls that were all in the same house taking showers at the same place. Most of you are unshowered, and that's all right. But we are so happy that you guys are here. I will try to go quickly for you guys to keep you engaged. But while we had just a Sunday in between series, we just wrapped up our Lessons from the Gym series. I'm going to tell you about our upcoming series here at the end of the service that I'm really excited about. I wanted to pause and focus on the church's responsibility with the next generation as we sit here at the tail end of Meta Weekend. All of these kids got here on Friday night and have been hanging out, learning about Jesus, talking about spiritual health, talking about sitting around the table, how their health affects other people for the whole weekend. And this is meant to kind of be the capstone for that weekend. And a lot of y'all know that I cut my teeth as a student pastor. That's what I came up doing. So I've had a lot of weekends like this, a lot of weekend retreats, and I love them because there's so much. First of all, there's so much fun that was had. I got a couple videos texted to me last night of my wife lip syncing on stage. So it looked like that was probably a good time. If you text me, I'll be happy to send those out throughout the congregation. It looked like a good time. They were having fun. There's stories that come out of those weekends. We believe, as Connor was saying, in connection and friendship here. And so connection and bonds are formed over weekends like that matter for a long, long, long time. So I believe they're hugely important. But most importantly, what happens over the course of those weekends, every time when you slow down, this happens to anybody. It's not just students. It's adults. It's everybody. When you slow down for 72 hours or 48 hours or however long it ends up being, and you just kind of cloud out everything else. You get rid of all the other stresses in life, and you just focus on what God has for you in this time. You always walk away with a desire to grow closer to Jesus. You always walk away with a little bit of more of a spiritual awareness, of an awareness of your spiritual health and a desire to grow in spiritual health a little bit. Like weekends like this always generate these commitments and decisions that really excite me. Because some of these kids, I know them, they walked in this weekend and they have a faith, but as a result of this weekend, they're very likely, some of them going, you know what, I want to take my faith more seriously. Spiritual things matter to me now. I want my faith to be the most important thing in my life. I hope some of you guys made that decision this weekend. Some of them came in, I've seen it happen before. You come into a weekend like this and you're under the impression because you grew up in church that you're a believer, that you're a Christian, but then you go through the weekend and you realize, oh my goodness, I've never really known Jesus. And so for the first time in their life, they come to know Jesus. Other people come into the weekend and they know that they're not a believer, but by the end of the weekend, they are a believer. And it's phenomenal and powerful and important and hopefully life-changing decisions have been made and will be carried out through the years. That's always my prayer. It's always my hope. And I always love to hear the stories. I can't wait to sit down with Kyle and to talk with Jen, my wife, who leads the upperclassmen girls, and hear the stories and the conversations and the commitments that came out of this weekend. And even as I get excited about those things, I've been in ministry long enough to, in the back of my mind, be wary of something that tends to happen. And it's going to feel when I bring it up like I'm being a little bit of a Debbie Downer. I don't mean to do that. Also, if your name is Debbie, that's a really stinky phrase for you. I'm sorry. I'm sure you're a lovely person. But I don't mean to be a downer about it, but whenever I have a weekend like this or see a weekend like this, I'm always reminded of a passage and a principle that we find in the book of Judges. Judges is in the Old Testament. It's, I think, the 7th book of the Bible off the top of my head. And it follows this book called Joshua. And in the book of Joshua, there's a man. Can you guess what his name is? His name's Joshua, and he follows Moses. Okay, so Moses has led the people out of slavery in Egypt. He's led them in the desert for 40 years. He's moved them around. He started the religion that we look to as Judaism. That's really the precedent to our religion. He began kind of our faith. He's given the 10 Commandments. He's written some books of the Bible, and now he's reached the end of his life. And the Hebrew people are on the banks of the Jordan River, and they're poised to cross and take over this land that was promised to their forefather Abraham several hundred years ago. But Moses sins. God doesn't let him have the privilege of doing that. And so there's a guy named Joshua that succeeds Moses, and he takes over leadership of the Hebrew people. And it's under Joshua's leadership that they cross the Jordan River. They go through what was then the land of Canaan, and they win these unbelievable battles. Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, some of you might be familiar with it. They didn't even have to fight. The walls just came down, and Team Jericho gave up, right? There was these 5 kings, the 5 kings of Ai, that got together and conspired against Joshua, overwhelming odds. And God gave Joshua power. He stopped the sun. He held it still, and Joshua won this incredible battle. So they sweep through Canaan, just conquering the cities, clearing out the land, and claiming it for God's people. Some of his tactics were so good that they still study them in war colleges now. Okay, so Joshua was a bad dude. He knew what he was doing. So they conquer the nation of Israel. They get there, they settle down, and then in Judges, they start their civilization. And so he looks at all the different people. There's 12 tribes of Israel. He looks at the head of all the tribes, and he says, okay, this is your land, this is your assignment, this is your land, this is where you guys live. And he divvies up the nation. And it's all settled and it's all done, and God has done a great work. And then Joshua reaches the end of his life. In verse 6 of chapter 2 of Judges, you can just listen. It says, when Joshua dismissed the people. So he gets them together. He says, you guys go live in these places, and he dismisses the people after all these great victories. And the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And then Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at 110 years old. They buried him in the boundaries of a certain place. And then in verse 10 it says, and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So the generation of Joshua, this triumphant generation that has seen all these miracles of God and has watched God do all these incredible things for them, and were by all accounts a very faithful and devout generation. They all were gathered and they went to their fathers. So that generation passes away. And then this verse happens, and it's a heartbreaking verse. It says, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done in Israel. And then after that is just verses of how they messed up. It says, after the generation of Joshua, this faithful generation passed away, after them arose another generation, and they forgot all the things that the Lord had done for their fathers and for their mothers and for their grandfathers and for their grandmothers. And because they forgot the Lord, and because they walked in their own direction, they began to chase, it says, after other gods. And that happens to us too. We leave the faith and we begin to prioritize other things. To chase after other gods doesn't mean that we erect idols in our home. It simply means that in our life, we prioritize something over our relationship with God. We value something more than we value God. That's what it means. And so that's what happened to the generation that forgot about God. And it's, to me, an ominous and a foreboding and a heartbreaking verse. We have this generation of people who were walking with the Lord, who are a devout people, who saw God move in incredible, undeniable ways. And their children rose up, going to church, going to weekend retreats, doing all the things that you do in the church. But yet somehow they forgot about God. And they fell away. And they prioritized other things over God. And the truth of it is, this isn't just something that happens in the book of Judges. That's a 1,000-year-old principle. This is something that we see happen too. If you spent any time in the church, you've seen it happen. I have a group of buddies. my closest friends in the world. I love every one of these guys. I would do anything to help them. They are my good friends. I hope that you have friends like this. It's 8 buddies. We're on a text thread. One of them has been my best friend since kindergarten. We were in children's church together. I'm not making this up. His name's PJ. We were in children's church together. We're sitting there. We're eating. They gave us snacks. I don't know. It was almonds. And at the same time, we chewed up our almonds and we showed them to the pastor's daughter who was sitting across from us. And she was grossed out and we high-fived and we were best friends. And that was it. That's how it went. The thickest thieves ever since, me and Peach. And then I made some other buddies in high school. And all of us still talk all the time, every day. We find ways to hang out at least twice a year. We get somewhere, because we live all over the country now, but we get together, we hang out about twice a year, at least. I love these guys. All of these guys, all 8 of them, believe it or not, not that this is necessarily a good thing, I think that the church does a terrible job of pushing people into vocational ministry. Like, if you're a good Christian, then you'll go find a way to get paid to be a Christian, when really we just need some more godly accountants. But anyways, all 8 of these guys ended up at one point or another in their 20s going pro and getting paid to be Christians. Okay, so they were in vocational ministry. They did Young Life, or they worked at churches, or they made videos for churches, or whatever it was. We all at different points went into ministry. And so I just say that so that you know that every single one of them at one point in their life would have said that my faith is the most important thing to me. 3, and I would say a half of them, that half would be offended if I called them the 4th, have totally walked away from the faith. Totally walked away. Began to encounter questions and issues and events in life. And they would look at me right now and they would say, at the best, I'm agnostic. I believe that there's probably a God. I don't think anything beyond that. They've walked away from the faith. They're supportive of me. They cheer for me. They love what's happening here in Raleigh. But they don't affirm it, and they don't claim it. And the one who's the half, I say half because he would still say that he probably has a Christian faith, but it's no priority to him. And for me, it breaks my heart that these guys would grow up in the church. They have good parents who love the Lord. They were in church their whole lives. They grew up. They went into vocational ministry. They prioritized their faith as much as you can prioritize it, but yet in our 30s and now in our 40s, they've walked away from the faith. And I see some of them raising kids with no faith at all. And it breaks my heart. And you've seen it too. For some of you, that's your story, right? You grew up in church, you did all the things, you did the meta weekends, you got the t-shirts, you made the commitment, it was great. Then you got to college and independence happened and you fell away from the faith. And that happens. And I like to position grace to be right here. For those of you who are coming back to the faith after wandering off, I'm like, here we go, let's have fun. Come on. That's okay. And then what happens is a big life event, marriage or children or something like that, or profound sadness over an unexpected tragedy, some big life event will happen and bring you back into the faith and have you prioritize your faith again. And some of you, that's your story, and you've been walking with the Lord ever since to varying degrees. Others of us, we've watched this happen to other people. And it's a really, to me, sad thing, and it's a big, to me, indictment of the church. Because what's true is this doesn't just happen in Judges. It's not an isolated thing with my group of friends. It's not unique to your story or to Grace or to some people that you know. Statistics bear out, based on research by the Barna Group, that a majority of kids who grow up in church, once they get to college, they leave church, they're out of the nest, they experience independence. A majority of kids who leave the church, who are youth group kids, walk away from the faith when they get to adulthood. A majority. Not some, not a lot, a majority. And that's a really sad statistic. I hate that statistic. I hate it so much that I'm bringing it up to cap off a really fun weekend. Sorry, team. Because I think if we talk about it and we ask essential questions about it, that this can actually be a hopeful and inspiring thing. And so in light of all of that, my story, your stories, the people you know where that happened, and just so we're clear, just as an aside, okay, if I've seen so many parents who watch their kids walk into adulthood and walk through seasons where they don't have any faith. And I've seen how it breaks the hearts of parents. And I'm terrified of that. Jen and I talk about that all the time with Lily. But just to say it, it's entirely possible to do all the right things as a parent. It's entirely possible to make all the right choices and put them in all the right places and teach all the right things in your home. And just have a child that needs to walk through a season of independence and for it not to be your fault. Okay? But that all of that begs this question that I think we should answer and look at this morning. The question that our church needs to think about is, what can we do to prevent generational fallout? What can we do to prevent generational fallout? What can we do, honestly, as a church this morning? What can we do to make sure that the decisions that were made this weekend stay intact? What can we do to make sure that they stay the course? What can we do to make sure that Grace is not a place that sends good, godly kids to college only to watch them walk away from the faith? What can we do to ensure that here we don't have the story of Judges and see a generational fallout? That becomes the question, right? And so I think that there are, the answer to this is multifaceted. There's a lot of decent ways to answer this question. I think this question is so important that as we are hiring the student pastor, we interviewed so many people. I looked at probably 60 to 80 resumes, and so did Cindy and the rest of the team. And then we interviewed folks, and we finally settled on Kyle. We were just getting tired of looking. We asked Kyle's the best. He's the stinking best. We love that guy. We asked every one of those candidates when we got to the point where we were talking to them this question: what do we do to prevent generational fallout? We didn't phrase it that way, but that was the question, right? And like I said, I think there's a lot of answers to this, and the candidates gave us a bunch of good answers, but I think we see one really good answer that we often forget, that I think if it characterizes Grace, we stand a good chance of preventing this cycle from taking place here. And it's a principle that we find in the book of 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 5, if you'd like, you can turn there. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul is writing to Timothy. Timothy's a young pastor. Paul is reaching the end of his life, the end of his ministry. Paul was a guy who went around planting churches and then writing letters back to the churches to encourage them, and that became our New Testament. So he's writing 2 letters to Timothy that become known as 1 and 2 Timothy, and he's instructing him on how to be a pastor, how to lead a church. And so there are some things that are in these 2 books that are just for pastors or just for elders or church leaders, and that's the application. But there are other things that apply to everyone in the church, and the advice that he gives him here at the beginning of chapter 5, I think, applies to all of us. And so this is what he says, and I'm going to read this, and you're going to go, I don't really know how that answers our question, but we'll get there, okay? I think it's a principle here that we find. This is how Paul advises Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5. He says this, verse 1, "Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity." So he's telling Timothy, listen, when you're dealing with the people in your church and you need to get on to an older man, maybe there's an older man, he's doing something he shouldn't be doing, do not rebuke him. You entreat him as a father. Do not look around at your peers and those younger and rebuke them. Treat them as brothers. Treat the older women as you would your mother. Treat the women, your peers, and those younger as your sisters. And so what we see Paul telling Timothy is the church is really designed to operate as a family. The church should operate as a family, right? That's what we are. We are a family of faith. Paul talks about this in Romans when he says that if you have faith, then you are an adopted son and daughter of the King with Jesus, co-heirs with Christ, he says. And you know, it's funny, I grew up Southern Baptist. My lovely wife grew up Southern Baptist. And in the church world, we like to make a lot of denominational jokes, right? We like to make fun of people. Often we make fun of Southern Baptists, and that's fine. Most of it is well earned. But there is one place where Southern Baptists actually did kind of get it right. Did any of you grow up in a church or have been around people where they called you brother or sister so-and-so? Yeah. There's a guy at my old church named Tim. He used to call me Brother Nate. He was the only dude there. It's like 1,800 people. He's this one old school dude going, Brother Nate, how you doing? And I used to love it. Brother Tim, how are you, baby? Like, that's great. I'm not advocating that. That would be weird now just to start that from scratch. But it's a cool attitude that they had in the church. It's one place where they got it, where they said, we're family, and family matters. And I think that this principle is incredibly important, to view those who go to church with us, who are in our family of faith, as our brothers and sisters and our fathers and our mothers in Christ. I think that's so important because we live in a culture that's increasingly independent, right? That's increasingly isolated. That's increasingly like, why are you talking to me? Right? We see this in greetings. If I were just to ask you, let's say that you're just in the lobby. And somebody walks in that you know, maybe you're in a small group with them, maybe you kind of serve on a team with them or whatever, and they go, hey, how you doing? And you go, great, how are you? And they go, not too good. Tough weekend. Wife's getting kind of sick. And some real issues with the mother, with the in-laws. I'm just stressed out at work. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep my job. It's tough. What are you thinking in your head? You're thinking, hate that for you. All right, I'm going to get some coffee. Right? Like, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to engage in that because we're isolated, and increasingly we think that's your issue. That's your deal. That's your kid. Hope it worked out for you. That's your marriage. I'll be praying for it. That means I'm going to forget that this happened, right? Like, that's what we do. We become increasingly isolated. But if we look at this principle and we realize that other believers are our family, it should shape the way that we think about them. How do you think about your family? Those of you who are lucky enough to have a family that you love and know, how do you think about them? I've shared before that I'm not as close with my sister as I would like to be. That's my fault. I'm working on that. That's my deal. But let me tell you something. There is nothing I wouldn't do for her. There's nothing I wouldn't do for her. She's got 3 beautiful daughters. There's nothing I wouldn't do for those girls. There's nothing I wouldn't do for my brother-in-law. Jen's family, I love Jen's family. There's nothing I wouldn't do for my in-laws and for my sister-in-law and for my brother-in-law and for their kids, right? We fight for our families. We love them. When they need something, we are there. We might not talk to them all the time. We might not check in with them every day, but we care about them and we fight for them. And when their marriages are struggling, we jump in. And when they're depressed, we talk to them. And when we can sense they're down, we take them out. We have fun with them. We try to cheer them up. That's what we do for family, right? Right now, somebody's going to have to do something for their family in the nursery. That poor kid. That's a bummer. We fight for family. They matter to us a lot. And what I want to see is us take on a mindset as a church that no, this isn't your kid, and that's not your marriage, and that's not your issue. Those are my issues. This is my family. These are my kids. These are my younger brothers and sisters. And what I want you to feel as Grace Church, like if you're here and visiting, you feel however you want to feel, okay? I'm not talking to you right now. You just look in and you take it in, and if you want to be a part of it, that's great. But if you call Grace home, I mean this. Their decisions are your decisions. The commitments they made this weekend, those are your commitments. The things that they decided to do, you fight for those things for them. You pray for those things for them. Not in the flippant way that says, yeah, I'll do that, but in the way that means I will write this down and I will pray over these decisions. You take ownership of the kids who are graduating from here, and you say, I will do whatever I can and whatever opportunities I have to fight for their faith as they go into college, to make sure that when these kids move on, they don't fall away from the faith. They're the influencers at their school that are drawing other people into the faith. That's what we fight for. We fight for marriages. When we see them struggling in our small group, we reach out even when it's uncomfortable because that matters to us, because that's my brother and that's my sister and I want to see it work. We reach out to the older crowd in our church. And we make sure that they're good and we make sure that they have what they need. We reach out to our friends and our peers who are moving into a season of life where they're taking care of their older parents, and we make sure that they have what they need or that they just have a respite. We look for ways to help. Those are not their issues. It's not their marriage. It's not their commitments. It's ours because we're a family. And when this principle really got impressed upon me, I'll never forget it. I was a student pastor at Greystone. And we had a great kid in the youth group named Tristan. Tristan came from a broken home. Now, there are some homes, there are some families that are divorced, and those parents do a phenomenal job of raising their kids together and of blocking them from what is usually carried out from divorce. There are some families who do a phenomenal job of that, but Tristan's family was not one of those. His dad was a mess. He got invited to church by a friend. He started coming to church for a couple of months, and he accepted Jesus. He became a believer. And shortly after becoming a believer, and this guy, he was a good-looking kid, man. He was athletic. He had everything going for him. He was charismatic. Everybody loved this kid. He comes to a retreat like this. And we didn't even talk about this on the retreat. It wasn't the point of the retreat. It was just a conviction that he reached on his own. And he came after the retreat and he shared with me and he said, Nate, I've decided that I want to save myself until marriage. I'm going to wait until I get married. And I said, that's great, pal. That's awesome. Good for you. Good for you. Let's pray for that. And I was so thrilled for him to reach that conclusion. It wasn't even a thing that we talked about. It was just something that the Lord impressed upon him after becoming a believer. And he said, this is what I want to do. And I was so excited for him. Then Tristan went home. And he told his dad about his new commitment. You know what his dad said? Tristan, don't be stupid. Don't do that. That's a big mistake. You got to live your life, buddy. I'm telling you, don't listen to those people. Broke my heart. You know what I realized? Tristan was a spiritual orphan. He had parents. He had a biological dad. But he didn't have anybody in his life that he could look up to as a spiritual father and say, I want to be like that. He didn't have anybody in his life that he could look up to and model himself after. And when you think about how your parents, those of you who had good ones, influenced you, not a whole lot of it was them sitting you down, telling you something in a Bible study format. It was just watching them and what they did and learning from them and how they went through life. And Tristan had nobody that he could look to and see as a spiritual father. He didn't have spiritual brothers and sisters around him in his life outside of church encouraging him. And Tristan, more than anybody I've ever met, needed a spiritual family. And it makes me wonder, how many people here in our church at Grace do we have who are spiritual orphans? Who have parents, but they don't have anybody in their life that's older than them that they look up to and they go, I want to be godly like that. I want to live my life how they live it. I want to learn from them. How many here are just going through life? How many young parents do we have who are just trying to figure out how to be parents without losing their minds at a 3-year-old, right? How many parents do we have who are trying to do that? And when they get to a spiritual place in their life, they don't have a parent that they can call and say, Dad, what'd you do in this situation? Mom, how did you handle this when this was happening in your marriage? Because they have parents, but they don't have spiritual parents. And so they come to church where they need them. How many young families do we have in this church who are just going it blind right now, trying to figure it out the best they can? How many older families do we have in this church who have kids in college or in young adulthood who don't quite know how to be parents, who don't quite know how to encourage faith in their kids, who don't quite know their way around it, who don't have anybody to look up to and anybody to call and say, hey, how'd you do this? My kid's making these decisions. It's breaking my heart. What do I do? How many people in our church don't have somebody to call when that happens? How many folks in our church are taking care of their older parents and don't know how to bear this burden in a godly way? How many folks in our church are retired and are looking around going, what do I do in retirement? How many spiritual orphans do we have here? The answer to that question impresses upon me the need that we have to see ourselves as family. What I want you to understand this morning, what I want you to see is that we have a generational responsibility to reach both forward and back. We as a church, as individuals in the church, and when I say we, I mean you, buddy, we have a generational responsibility to reach both forward and back. To look at the generation in front of us and grab somebody and pay attention to them and go, how do I do this? How do I navigate life? And to reach back behind you and to grab them and say, let me show you how to get through this season of life. Let me fight for your commitments that you're making. We have a generational responsibility to do this. We have to. And I think if we do this, we protect the commitments that they made. What if all of them had a room full of 20 and 30-year-olds who were reaching back and pouring into them and helping them and being a contact for them after they went off to college, kind of like their small group leaders are right now? What if our young families with young kids are pouring into the people in our church that are just getting married and started out and don't have young kids yet? What if our parents with kids in the youth group are pouring into our parents over here with kids in the nursery? What if our parents with kids in college are pouring into those below them, right? What if we actually did this and we actually looked out for one another? Can you imagine the health and the sustainability of Grace? I've said as your pastor often, I don't care about growing big, I care about growing healthy. Is there a healthier way to grow than this? Than to accept our generational responsibility to reach both forward and back? So how do we do this? What does it look like practically? Because it's great to say it, but what do we do? And this is a tough answer, but here's one of the things I think we do. I think there's really two things that we do. First, we intentionally put ourselves in multi-generational situations, okay? If you don't have anybody who's older or younger than you right now that you could reach out to and you'd be like, hey, let's grab coffee. And listen, if you do have that, do it. If you have somebody that God's been laying on your heart to reach out to and be like, hey, I want to learn from you. Can we grab some coffee? Or if you have someone who is younger than you and God's been placing them on your heart and for some reason you can't get them out of your head, send them an email. Be like, hey, let me buy you coffee. I just want to hear more of your story. Everybody's up for coffee. And listen, as a dude who knows literally every 30-something and below in this church, all of them would love to get an email from someone older than them going, hey, let's talk. All of them. None of them would turn it down. I know it's an awkward thing, but I promise it would work out. So if that's not an option for you, what do? We put ourselves in multi-generational environments. A great example of this, I'm going to pick on him. I've got a buddy at the church named Ben. Ben's a good dude. He's from Wendell, by way of Tobaccoville, so he's still got that accent that we like, right? And I have a Wednesday morning Bible study. It's at 6 a.m. to keep out the riffraff, and so at 6 a.m., the dudes come. There's 10 or 12 guys that come every week, and what I love about this is it's multi-generational. Connor comes sometimes. Connor comes. He's the youngest. We got folks who are nearing retirement. We got everybody in between. And I love it. And Ben has flat told me, because we're buddies, bro, I'm not waking up to hear what you have to say about the Bible. I'm getting up because there's older men in this group and I want to be around them. It's an intentional decision that he's made. The right decision. And he makes a fair point. I wouldn't get up to hear what I have to say either. But he's intentionally placed himself in a multi-generational environment so that he can begin to learn from those above him. And he's pouring into those who are younger than him in different ways. You can do that too. As we have Bible studies, sign up for them. There's a Bible study here on Monday nights. It's a bunch of old men who would love to really, like Harris right here, who would love to pour into younger men that are interested, right? Do that. Put yourself in those environments. Sign up for something like that. When you're in your volunteer teams, look around and take notice of who else is there. One of the greatest strengths of Grace is that we are multi-generational and generationally diverse. We should take advantage of this. The next thing that you do after you've placed yourself in those environments is you pray. And you ask that God would help you to notice the opportunities you have to have real conversations. And instead of throwing those out, you engage in them. And you watch the opportunities come up. And you begin to learn from other people who are older than you. And you begin to see people who are younger than you that may be struggling a little bit. And it becomes perfectly acceptable and comfortable to shoot them a text and go, hey, I just wanted to check on you. You doing good? You want to get some coffee? Grace, I think that if we'll do this, if we'll embrace our generational responsibility to reach both forward and back, if we will intentionally place ourselves in multi-generational environments and then be prayerfully sensitive to what we can do there, I think we'll be a healthy place. I think we'll be a church that operates as a family. And I think that we will be a place that beats the odds and does not graduate generation after generation that walks into college and falls away from the faith, but that we will be a church of unique health and vibrance because we look out for each other and we fight for each other as family because we, like God, see everybody else here as our brothers and our sisters in Christ. Let's do that. Let's fight for each other and let's fight for these kids. All right, let's pray. Father, we love you. We're so very grateful for you. Lord, I'm so grateful that you filled this church with folks from all different generations, all different times, all different ages and demographics. I pray that you would begin to bridge those gaps, that you'd begin to look out for us, or help us look out for one another. Help us see one another as brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers. Help us fight for one another and take a vested interest in one another. God, give us the courage to send an email or a text. Give us the courage and the bravery to step into an environment that may not be the most comfortable for us. And make this a place, God, where faith is fought for, where commitments are owned by everyone, and where your help, God, and your love and your vibrancy abound. It's in your Son's name we pray these things.